Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's podcast episode. My name is Bianca Beck, and I am the Middle East Marketing Manager at Sovereign PPG, which is the Middle East offices for the Sovereign Group. We're going to be diving into the intersection of education and human resources today, and how both are working together to shape the future of teaching and learning here in the UAE. Education landscape is really evolving so rapidly, and there's really a number of factors contributing to this. There is the growing expat population. Families are really placing a premium on the quality of education. We are seeing an increased demand for these top tier schools, and wait lists are growing, particularly at some of the more popular institutions. And recently, there's also been an announcement of school fee increases across the UAE. All of these really highlight the high demand and competitiveness of this space, I think. Today, we're lucky to be joined by three experts, each bringing a really unique perspective on this changing landscape. We're joined by Joe Smeed, who is our Occupational Pensions and Savings Executive at the Sovereign Group. Joe will be primarily discussing employee benefits in the education sector. We've got Jane Barraclough, who is the Managing Director and Editor-in-Chief of Yalla magazine. She will be discussing the Yalla 100 Standout UAE Schools Guide and how that is helping families to navigate school choice. And then finally, Faraz Ahmed, our HR consultant here in the UAE, who will kind of cover the more broader HR and people management trends that is shaping the education sector. I think what's really becoming clear is twofold. Firstly, families are thinking more holistically about education. They're looking at how schools are aligning with their children's personalities, learning styles, and kind of longer term goals. It's not purely just about academics for families anymore. They want to know about pastoral care, leadership, and how they're preparing their kids for the future. And then the second thing is that schools are under a lot of pressure, not to just deliver results, but to attract and retain exceptional educators in a really competitive job market. Schools are massive employers, and how they support their staff has a direct impact on the learning environment that they create, really. So I'm excited to dive into today's topic. So let's get started. Jane, I'd really like to start with you first. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired the creation of Yalla? I've actually got a copy of it right here. Yalla 100 Standout UAE Schools Guide. How does it support families in navigating, which school to choose?
Hi, Bianca. Thanks very much for the introduction. So, yes, this is a first. It's a first for the UAE. And I think what's very interesting about the UAE is it's permanently on the news feeds around the world as a huge economy and growing population. And with that becomes more parents. And schools guides are not new. There are guides in the UK, there's guides all over the world. And the reason why Yalla published the first schools guide for the UAE was the basis that there were 550 schools here now and 17 different curricula. And as parents who are coming from all over the world to live and work and educate their children, how do parents go about choosing the right school for their child? As a parent myself, and having lived in the region over the last 20 years, we've seen the whole educational sector grow massively, and the population's increasing, and so are the number of schools. But determining the right school for your child is quite a complex decision, and parents are certainly at this stage confused by the range of choice. It's a positive because I think the UAE landscape, we're very lucky as parents living here to have such a choice. We wouldn't have this choice ordinarily in our home country, but therefore it's critical that we as parents make the right decision for our children and also for future readiness. The world is changing at great speed, and we need to make sure that we choose a school that also helps your child to prepare for life after school. So where they study and what they study is vital. It's a critical decision.
Absolutely right. I'm actually interested to hear a little bit more on the guide, how you chose to assess these different schools. What kind of criteria did you have in place? Because I know that you have based it on kind of several factors, right? So what are they, and kind of how did you come to determining the assessment criteria?
Another good question. Yes, it's really important. I think the basis of having this guide was to also create an impartial guide. So Yalla, we are the publishers, we are the mouthpiece, but we didn't choose the schools. We partnered with Carfax Education, who are a global educational consultancy who have been in the region for many years, who embarked on putting together a panel, an educational panel that are based on educationalists, ex-heads and educational consultants who've been in the region here and know the schools. They were the ones that decided on the 100 standout schools. The criteria wasn't just based on the ADEC or KHDA, which are the governing bodies here, Kings. It's not a rating. It was to look at academic results. It was also to look at the extracurricular. It was to look at the pastoral care, but also future readiness, how the schools are preparing children for life after school. So we've clearly identified in the guide exactly the specific criteria as to how schools were judged. Just because a school is not outstanding does not mean it still is not the right school for your child. So it was important to get that across.
Okay, and then in your opinion, off of the back of having, completed this guide, what makes a school truly stand out beyond academics?
So a school has to look at the whole child. Pastoral care is really important. We're living in a world where soft skills are going to be AI, sustainability. It's about being able to produce children who are well-rounded and resilient young adults. That's what schools need to be able to prepare children for world outside school. So again, it depends. It's not a sort of it's not a mass equation. It very much depends on your child, the right fit, the right environment, your child's personality. It's not just about the academic skills either. So, I've had children, I've had three children. My third one went through a much more vocational academic experience and absolutely thrived. So again, it's about determining the right educational curriculum and style of learning for your child. These are the things that you want a school that can offer that breadth and that depth. And of course, leadership. Strong leadership transcends throughout a school. And if you can find a school with that leadership that is inspirational and you and your child relate to, then that's also something that's critical for looking at what makes a standout school.
Yeah. And I read in the guide this concept of ones to watch. Why did you think it was really important to highlight some of the emerging schools?
So we live in an emerging part of the world, and there are new schools coming online all the time, the announcements of new schools. But to be able to be nominated for the guide, you do have criteria, as I've explained. And therefore, a new school hasn't met that criteria at that stage. They won't have had maybe academic results to publish. They might not have had a school's inspection. And these are important benchmarks that any school must undergo in order to be nominated. Yet to leave them out would be very misleading because there are schools out there that are doing some incredibly innovative things in sustainability, inclusion, or tech integration. So we wanted to make sure that they were included as well. They might not be a household names, therefore they are proving themselves, but that doesn't mean that they're not going to be a standout school in the next 2-3 years. So they're certainly very important to consider for parents who are looking for the right school for their child.
And in your experience through all this, have parental expectations changed and evolved? What should families really be focusing on when it comes to choosing a school for their child?
Again, it depends on your child, but parents are absolutely engaged. There's a wealth of information out there and they are researching thoroughly. They need more information to be able to make that decision. Hence the reason why we've published this guide, because this guide is not just a list of schools. There's a lot of editorial content explaining the landscape here in the UAE, the educational landscape, explaining the difference from not-for-profit, profit, selective versus non-selective, explaining the difference between BTEC, IB, A-level, These are all really important considerations that parents want to know about. We also are helping parents guide them through what to look for, what questions to ask for in the tour. And I think the important thing here is in the UAE, every school is fee paying. And parents do come from around the world, from schools where they may not be so used to paying for education. Therefore, they do come with a long list of questions and requirements
Expectations.
and expectations are high. So, of course, that is quite a sea change for many parents who are coming to live here.
Joe, I'm interested to actually hear your thoughts on this space because, we often, behind the schools are the teachers and the leadership, and we hear about teacher shortages here in the Middle East, but I think globally, and, teacher burnout. So, what is it that schools can be doing to retain and, well, attract initially, but then retain this kind of top teaching talent? Because I think this has a big part in what makes the school great. So especially in a region like the UAE. So what I want to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's four main forces at play. I mean, as you've sort of alluded to in your intro, it is a tough recruitment. And they say that there'll be, by 2030, globally around the world, there'll be a shortage of 44 million teachers. So you've got to fill that gap, and that's a really hard thing to do. So it's important to stand out in the crowd. Another issue is that it is a results-driven business. So it's really important that when you do get that top talent, that you keep them, because then you need to deliver on, your promise to the parents and also to the children. And the type of teachers that are coming in, there's a lot changing in the workplace now. So you've got millennials and Gen Zs particularly coming into the workforce, and they're more demanding. I mean, they're really wanting, they're striving for financial independence. They're really committed and they're wanting choice and flexibility and portability. So they're pushing these employers and saying, basically, what can you do for us? For us to come and work for you, but for us to stay. And the sector has been criticised in the past, actually, for the fact that, they've had teachers that have maybe thought they were going to do 2 to 5 years, ended up loving living in the Middle East, and they've spent their whole career there. But they haven't been paying into their home country. And then they're limited as to when they can retire, and they really suffer, they can suffer from pensioner poverty and work a lot longer. So duty of care is really coming into focus now for schools. And so all of this is, the schools are juggling all these.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think maybe we could go a little bit more into, what kind of benefits schools can be offering employees, because I'm sure as Faraz will kind of comment on, there's stuff that's, you have to do because of labor law. And then if you look at teaching packages these days, what used to probably be benefits at the time, like staff allowances for their kids to attend schools, and travel packages and housing packages, that's become a bit of a stock standard now. So how do you stand out in the crowd essentially and retain that teacher satisfaction?
Yeah, it's a good question. And although schools do worry about it, it is actually, there are simple solutions out there. So at Sovereign, as you say, there's that mandatory obligation. So we can provide an end of service benefit investment account. And that's great for the schools because they can pay into it regularly. So that's helping their cash flow, and they'll benefit from investment growth. But it's great for their people as well, because they know that they're going, that the school's going to meet their obligation, which hasn't always been the case if you suddenly get a big bunch of leavers leaving the teaching cohort. And as you say, attracting and retaining is key. And as Jane was saying about leadership as well. So you can also, schools are beginning to put in now additional employer contributions. So that would be on top of their end of service benefit. And that they can have a benefit where it's for the whole population, but it can increase in percentage depending on maybe length of service, or if there's a particular subject that's hard to attract and retain, like maths and science, or you could just put it in for the leadership. I mean, Jane was saying how important it is to have leadership, and you want that continuity and drive within the school and stability. So they can put in additional benefits there for them.
Yeah.
And then although it's hard to believe, but a lot of people say work in the Middle East for 5 to 7 years, and they often leave either in debt or with no money. So you can also put in a savings portion. And that means that teachers, all they have to do is say to the school, I want to take 10% of my salary and save it into a savings account. And they can use that, they could use that to buy a house, or they can use that to pay for a wedding or their own kids' education. And it's these sorts of benefits that really help schools stand out in the crowd, be an employer of choice, but it also helps their people, which is, important as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you said there about offering benefits at varying levels, right? Because skill shortages are so different. It's interesting that you said maths and science. One of my really good friends is a math teacher, and she basically has her choice of the schools here because there's such a shortage of math teachers. Also, male primary teachers are gold dust, apparently, because obviously they're less common. Yeah, so some really interesting points there about potentially varying levels of benefits depending on experience, skill shortage, and where you kind of really need the retention. Faraz, from an HR perspective, obviously we touched on this just before about education, the education system is massive employers here in the UAE. So what are some of the biggest challenges you would say you see schools facing in terms of managing and supporting staff effectively?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think Jane and Joe have covered pretty much the retention fact, but that is one of the biggest issues in the UAE. Just a quick kind of info on that. So in 2023, I believe it was, retention rates in the UAE, or turnover rates in the UAE for schools primarily, were about 60%. If you compare that to countries like the UK, the US, and Korea, they're 3 to 5%, right? And so the educational industry here is drastically different to what you would have in the UK. Going back to one of the things you mentioned, Jane, in small cities in the UK, you have one school, right? And that's where everyone goes. That's where your parents would have gone. That's where your siblings would have gone. That's where your
Choice is
grandparents
super
would have gone.
limited.
Exactly, right. So here, the biggest issue is that retention issue. It's schools have this intense competition to try and find the right talent, the experienced talent, especially for difficult subjects, maths, science. So your entire STEM curriculum, or inclusion teams, your leadership teams. Retention really is one of the bigger issues. Another one would be work-life balance and kind of dealing with burnout. So I've got friends in schools, I've got mates that have been kind of heads of departments, and I've seen firsthand the degrading of their mental health and stability as it goes on, because there is such a large workload, right? Schools here range from 500 to 700 kids. And any one head of department could be overseeing 7, 8, 10 different classes. So dealing with that burnout, I think, is really important, and having systems and checks in place that can deal with those burnouts. So we're talking employee wellbeing programs, or offering mental health days, or offering flexible timing, or at least having someone that can come in and help with the workload. A really big thing actually that was conducted by the KHDA was that 48% of leavers in schools in the UAE left because there was a lack of professional development. And I think that is such a significant thing that people, or schools as employers, are missing out on, is continuous development. We, like Joe said, right, we've got Gen Zs coming in, we've got millennials in, and as a generation, we appreciate that continuous development a lot more. So identifying the fact that these teachers are coming in, they've got aspirations that they eventually want to become a head of department, that they eventually want to become head of secondary or head of primary, or even go up to leadership teams, right? They need the support from their employers to be able to move up those steps and move up those ladders. And I think the problem there then becomes is, how do you identify who's going to go up the career succession planning ladder? You can't, as a school, obviously pay for every single teacher's career development expenses, because then that just becomes an overhead that's not sustainable. So there's a lot of different things there for schools to battle through from a HR perspective, at least. And I've worked with schools in the past. They've been clients. I've worked with the Talim Group, for example. They're one of the largest ones in the UAE, with about 30 plus schools. So I've seen all these challenges there, and they very closely are interlinked with what Joe said and what Jane's brought up about the volume of schools as well as kind of how teachers and staff are being brought in.
Yeah, I think what you and Joe are saying really closely ties together, right? Because additional employee benefits also not necessarily makes up for the fact of not being able to. If you can't progress somebody in a salary wise, how can you upskill them? How can you offer them things that aren't
Yeah.
necessarily monetary? And so
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of interest, potentially a lot of interest in there. If you're saying, those stats on upskilling and the kind of demand for that. How have you seen the conversation around employee well-being in the education sector, evolve, especially in recent years? I feel like it's become a focus, in most workplaces. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's definitely, there's been a positive shift towards, like you said, a more holistic approach, not just from a parent perspective, but from an employer perspective as well. And I think schools and the HR in schools and leadership teams in schools are starting to realize that educators and their mental health has a direct correlation to the students and their performances. Yeah. And I think schools are now becoming a lot more proactive in their approach, especially with well-being. Schools offer comprehensive support systems. They have employee wellness programs, mental health days. I'm seeing a big shift now in flexi time. So my wife works in a school and where term time off for just teachers would have been the normal thing, they're now shifting that approach towards admin staff, support staff as well. So we're definitely seeing a very positive shift towards schools adapting other industry practices, flexi time, remote working, etc. So there's a very positive change coming, and it's looking good. And I think in conjunction with what Joe said about offering benefits that beyond just the statutory limitations, then those are the schools that are going to keep, that are going to attract, but also keep the best talents.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because, at the end of the day, the people within the organization are what drive the organization to success, right? And to delivering results, which we know, Jane, based on, the criteria that performance is really closely monitored. I know it's not necessarily currently one of the criteria assessment that Yalla looks at, but do you think it could be for the future? Do you think that parents are starting to care a little bit more about how schools are treating their staff and therefore the output that they put as a teacher?
I think to an extent, yes. Of course, the two go hand in hand, as we've discussed. So, you end up with happy children if they're happy with their teaching in the school, and the teacher's happy, of course. It's all interlinked. And there are schools here in the region who have had teachers for 15, 20 years plus, so there are some very established schools here who have managed to retain their teachers. So let's hope that's something that follows through to other schools. Of course, there are lots of new schools here, so sometimes it's too early to judge, isn't it? Because they haven't been in the region for more than sort of 5-6 years. So time will tell. But I think, of course, it's vital that there is this welfare system in place that supports teachers, because, of course, that transcends down to the learning of your individual child.
Exactly. And essentially what ends up being a standout school is the people driving the education and the performance within it, right?
Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear what the response has actually been like for this guide from parents and the schools, because if you want to be recognized as one of the top 100, surely there's got to be quite a lot of, how do we get into the next issue? How does it work actually? Is this kind of a fixed thing? Do schools already establish a feature to get, preference for the next year? How does it work? And what has been
No, it will evolve and it will change year on year. The criteria won't change. Maybe we'll add a few different elements to the criteria, but essentially new schools will come into the region. So that's what will change it. And the feedback's been tremendous. 2 years ago, I met with a lot of the heads here across the UAE and said, do you feel that there's a need for such a guide? And it was a unanimous yes, just because the range of parents you're getting coming here, but also just to be able to create some benchmarks so that you're able to guide parents into finding not one school fits all. So it's really important. It's the most important decision I believe we make as parents. So if we can help steer parents to making that decision with giving them the impartiality and objectivity, which is so fundamental to the integrity of the educational sector, then that's great. So yes, we're working on edition 2, and we publish beginning of November each year. So watch this space. But no, the feedback's been tremendous. So we're working with a lot of the corporates to ensure that it's part of their onboarding process within the welcome packs. So there's huge growth for us in terms of positioning this guide as a sort of a must read for all parents entering the UAE, but also parents who are here transitioning to become parents for the first time.
Yeah, a really nice way to kind of cut through the noise, right? We joked about this offline, but I was saying that, in my area, Al Barsha, we have 8 schools that are lined up one next to each other, like the gates interlink practically, and that's very unique. So if you're arriving for the first time and kind of looking at just my street, you'd be overwhelmed, like, where do I even start?
Yeah, it's true.
But I think, Faraz, we also talked about this, that a huge demographic of parents is actually teachers as well, right?
Yeah.
And that plays a large part in kind of choice. A lot of people come here as young professionals and then go on to have families of their own, and then that forms part of the network of people that go into schools and such. Joe, yeah, exactly. It's a cycle. Joe, I know that you were here recently actually with us, and you did a bit of a Middle East tour because you were here for the British School Middle East Conference. Just talking on, because I think actually still, we're very familiar with pension products, especially if you come from a European background, or a lot of places across the globe offer pensions. But, we've got our end of service gratuity here, but it's not necessarily the same as a pension. So, it's just the end of service gratuity is obviously a legal requirement, but a pension setup is not, it's not mandatory. So what has the uptake been with that and your time at the conference? How were people receptive to a pension product within education?
But no, I think, international schools is an immature employee benefit market. I mean, these sort of products have been around for decades for people, for other sectors that employ international staff, be that oil and gas or pharmaceutical, non-government organisations, that sort of thing. But the schools are really adapting quickly, and they need to, because they've got those pain points of attracting and retaining staff and quality and all the things that we've spoken about. So it was I was having great chats with the BSME population, and a lot of the teachers popped by and went, I know I've got to do something, and I never quite get round to it because they're always so busy. So schools being able to put something simple in place just takes all that worry away. I think schools were a little bit concerned. It's not something that they particularly know about, but these our products are very simple and they're very transparent, and it just makes it easy for the school to deliver it, and it's great for the teachers because they just have to. It's given to them on a plate, basically.
Yeah, so because obviously, like I said, we don't have a mandatory pension scheme here, but I think it's something that people are aware of, and the point that you mentioned before about you don't want to have built this career and life for yourself abroad and then end up potentially leaving one day and having nothing to your name. So I've actually started using the sovereign savings plan myself, and I use it as the opportunity to tax myself, because we have the absolute benefit of not, being taxed on our income. I started seeing it as this is the tax that I'd, possibly be taxed somewhere else. And then I've got a bit of a savings for my future.
Absolutely. And it's so important because, everybody sort of gets to their 50s and then starts thinking about pension, but you really need to start further back.
Yeah.
You need to start in your 20s and 30s, and then it supercharges it. And it's just getting into that discipline of just paying, even if it's small amounts, just paying it in regularly, and then you get all the benefit of time and dollar cost averaging and all that good stuff. So if you want choice about when you're going to retire, where you're going to retire, and what type of retirement you're going to have, then you've got to save.
Yeah. So I hope with time we start to see. They are already working really closely together, but I think the 3 different points that we've all kind of been discussing today, the values reflect all the way through, don't they? The way educators teach is dependent on their environments, but the way students learn is also dependent on their environment. So all of these things really need to align. I hope we see actually parents going forward, concerning themselves a little bit more about how teaching staff are treated and kind of taken care of, because it kind of just brings this whole thing together in that circle of life that we were talking about. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for your time. What a great discussion. I feel like a really interesting topic, especially for the demographic of parents and teachers that we have here. It's a bit of a running joke, I think, in the UAE that when you meet someone, you ask the question, are you cabin crew or are you a teacher? So, there will be a lot of people, I think, interested in this topic. So thank you all so much for your time today.
Thank you, Bianca.
Thank you for having us.
Good to
Thanks a
chat to
lot.
you guys. Speak soon.
All the best.
Bye-bye.